Good afternoon. As announced, we're going to be talking tonight about the subject of training up a child, and specifically the difference between teaching and training. You know, the Bible talks about a number of different skill sets for parents. One of the most important is that of nurturance. We're told to make sure that we raise our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The word there, nurture, in the King James, literally it means warming. So we want a close-knit family, right? You kind of snuggle up together, you keep each other warm, you cherish each other. So there's certain things you want to do in parenting to bring about closeness. I mean, that's obviously one of the reasons you have kids, right? Is to enjoy that close-knit feeling of love that a healthy family enjoys. In one of these future lessons on parenting, I'm going to talk about creative parenting, and most of them focus on the idea of nurturance. Then there's also, of course, admonition. Sometimes the word is just translated discipline. But while nurture connotes warming, this connotes warning. This is where you counsel your children. You give them a word of admonition. Proverbs 29:17, correct your son, and he shall give you rest. Yea, he shall give delight unto your soul. Isn't that a wonderful promise? Children are supposed to be a blessing, right? And if you follow these biblical principles and you're conscientious with these, they're much more likely to be a wonderful blessing than what happens if these things are neglected. So this is where you tell children, don't play in the traffic, you're going to get hurt, admonition, warning, right? And then, of course, there's instruction. Deuteronomy chapter 6 talks about formal instruction, which is what I'm doing now. And there's times, like around the dinner table at home, to have sort of formal instruction. My dad used to do that a lot when we were growing up. And then there's informal instruction. That's the kind that I think is often overlooked, that can be so powerful, where you look for teachable moments. The figure in Deuteronomy 6 is, he says, if you want to pass on these values to your children and to your grandchildren and to your great-grandchildren, it says you talk about these biblical principles, you talk about God, you talk about his word when they rise up and when they sit in the house and when they walk along the way and when they come into the doorpost of your house and there is a frontlet before your eyes. And so you just constantly are reminding your children at different times about God's creation and different things that reinforce who we are and our worldview and our faith. Then the fourth area is the idea of training. Proverbs 22 and verse 6 is probably one of the most famous verses in the Bible. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Well, what really is this idea of training? You look up training in a dictionary, and this is what it says. It says, instruct by exercise or drill, to prepare for a contest, to point in an exact direction with feedback. You go to boot camp, I'm told you're given a drill sergeant. Glad I never had to go to boot camp. I hear it's pretty rough, and that they point you in a certain direction, and you're supposed to be learning how to march and hold your weapon in a certain way, and that drill sergeant, if you're just off just a little bit, will let you know about it real quickly, and then you try it again, and you try it again until they finally got you down to a really mean and effective fighting force. When I was in high school on the swim team, I was a 100 butterflyer, and many, many times before the big meet, or certainly before city finals, I would practice. Timers and judges ready, swimmers on your mark, and boom, I'd go, and then I'd want to know what my time was, and did I beat my best time from before? And I'd try to mimic exactly the way it would be in the actual contest, the actual race. And that was obviously training. We understand training in the context of athletics. We understand training in the context of what they do in the military. And there is a sense in which we need to value and understand how to use appropriate training when we train up our children in the way that they should go. I have to confess to you that Gail and I didn't really understand the importance of the role of training because we were having some real difficulties with at least our firstborn. We were teaching, we were having devotions, but we were not able to be really effective in having her at a 2.5-year-old age. You're at a church potluck, everybody's there, and she kind of runs off, and she's running into where some cars are, and it could be dangerous, and so we yell, Amy, stop. And she doesn't stop, and everybody's watching. And so Dad runs over, embarrassed that Amy ignored Dad's command to stop. And so I, of course, ran and grabbed her so she wouldn't be out in the street. And we had instructed our kids. We taught them a lot. And we had taught them to obey, but, there's all these people around, and she's excited. And she just really embarrassed her mom and dad, let's just put it that way. And I remember one of members in the church there walked up to me and said, "You don't have control of your little one. You better get control of her quick or you're going to be sorry." And he walks off kind of shaking his head. Somebody else told us that they thought Amy was spoiled because we didn't have enough control over her. And Gail shed a few tears, and we thought, well, we're certainly taking this seriously. We have devotions every night. Dad tucks them in. We, give them discipline as needed. We thought, where are we going wrong here? And so we finally decided that it was time to get some counsel from a wiser, older woman in the church. I think one of the neglected resources that the Bible says we're supposed to be tapping into all the time, that oftentimes we don't, is the admonition to let the older women teach the younger women how to love their husbands and love their children. And sometimes I know it's just easier, I guess, maybe to talk to your peers, but talking to someone who's been there, done that, and has a pretty good success track record, it just makes a lot of sense. So this lady was in her 80s, just really godly, knowledgeable, wonderful lady in the faith. So we asked if we could come and talk to her. And so we went and told her some of the things that were going on. We told her that we had asked Amy on the way to church one day, what do we do at church? She goes, pray and spank. And we weren't too happy about that response. And so, I was up preaching, and Gail would be there with the kids by herself. And, it can be a challenge keeping the kids sort of quiet while other people are trying to worship. And so we asked Christine Reeder, what do you advise here? And she said something very, for me, it was like this defining moment. She said, well, are you training her? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, are you at home telling her what you expect and then saying, okay, Amy, run, and then say, Amy, stop. And then if she doesn't stop right away, you say, no, you didn't stop right away. You took a couple of steps. Let's try that again. And if you need to, you go ahead and you just actually role play it for her and say, I mean, you need to stop on a dime, and you need to listen, and you need to do this immediately. Okay. And so Amy finally really meant what we understood what we meant when we said, Amy, stop. It wasn't stop after 2 or 3 steps. It wasn't slow down. It was stop immediately. And actually, when your kid's running out into traffic, this could be the difference between life and death, right? And so we role-played with her, and she really caught on pretty quickly. And then after when it would stop immediately and turn around and come back to us, we would praise her. And we would say, good job, super, give her positive affirmation. And what was a weakness with this training that Christine Reeder had recommended, really became strength. And she said, how about this? Why don't you set Amy down and at home say, we're going to go ahead and kind of play like we're worshiping God in the church building. And that's a time where you need to be quiet and you need to not disturb other people. And so do you think you could really be quiet and not squirm and not make any noise for about 5 minutes? She goes, oh, I can do that. So you set the timer, you go 5 minutes, and then you praise her, good job. Then next time it's 10, then 15, then 20, till you can get her up to about an hour. And then you're driving to services and you say, okay, you know what to do. We did this at home. You know how to behave, And so sure enough, yeah, I got it, I know. The training at home and building the tolerance up over time made a huge difference in her being able to behave in services. It's the difference between teaching, just telling somebody what you want, and giving them trial runs and role-playing and training them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And I'm a little embarrassed, but I was in my early 30s, and I just had never heard that, never really thought about that. Didn't hear people talk about that very much. And it was just a real defining moment, I think, for both Gail and me. So let's kind of explore this a little bit more. Let's think about Samuel just for a minute. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11, Hannah, of course, prayed unto the Lord, and she was barren, and she wanted a child. And she told the Lord that if you will allow me to conceive and have a child, that I will give this child back to you. I'll name him Samuel, which means answered prayer. And I'll give him back to you. What she meant by that is that she would basically dedicate his life to the temple service. So in 1 Samuel 1 and verse 27, she said, I've lent him to the Lord, and as long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Imagine that was difficult for Hannah to be departed from Samuel after he was weaned. And back in Old Testament days, they would, nurse a child much longer time period than what we typically do today. But it's interesting how compliant and how obedient Samuel was about this plan for his life. And I also want you to consider how well trained Samuel was when he is, it's hard to say exactly, but it appears to be a young teen. And he hears the voice of God, and he thinks it's Eli. And so God speaks in apparently just a normal tone of voice, similar to what Eli's voice would have sounded like. And says, Samuel, Samuel. And he jumps up immediately, runs into Eli and says, did you call me? And Eli goes, no, I didn't call you. You must have heard something. So he goes back to bed, and then he hears the voice of God again, Samuel, Samuel. And he runs into Eli, says, did you call me? Eli says, no, I didn't call you. And then the third time, Eli says, it's the voice of God. So respond next time that, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. And then, of course, the next day he had to tell Eli what God had told Samuel. One of the things that's often overlooked in this particular account is how when Samuel was called one time in a normal tone of voice, he jumped up immediately and responded to the voice. And my question is, can you train a child to come the first time you call him or her without raising your voice or yelling or going through some other sort of frustrating gyrations for the parent in order to get some sort of compliance. Well, it was possible for Samuel, and certainly it's possible to train your children to do similarly. It's also interesting to contrast Samuel with the sons of Eli. It says in 1 Samuel 2 and verse 12 that the sons of Eli knew not the Lord. What a difference there is between Samuel, who's this godly prophet and is well respected by everyone and loves the Lord, and one of the few people, of course, that the Lord actually chooses to speak to, and the sons of Eli, who were raised in the house of Eli and raised in a similar environment, but they knew not the Lord. And the Bible says that they were irreverent. They had no respect for spiritual things and for their holy work in the temple. In fact, they were dishonest. They were stealing from the common people. Instead of taking what was their share as a priest, they were sort of double dipping and taking more than what should have been the case. And they were immoral. They were actually laying with women at the court of the temple. I mean, talk about a travesty. And here you're going to this holy place. This is still during the time of the tabernacle. And the people that are in charge are as immoral and irreverent and ungodly as you can imagine. So the result is that many people stop going up to the tabernacle to offer up their sacrifices as the law said that they should. And you can understand why it'd be pretty hard to go ahead and offer up your sacrifices when the priests are as corrupt as Eli's sons were. So many people just didn't bother. And it caused many people to transgress. Terrible situation here. What went wrong? Eli was righteous. Eli taught his sons what was right. He modeled before his sons what was right. And when he heard the reports about what they were doing, he scolded his sons. He tells them in 1 Samuel 2, beginning at verse 23, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all the people. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear." And so here he is scolding them, saying this is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. But the sons, the Bible says, hearken not to the voice of their father. Now, Eli was still there in the temple, in the tabernacle. And he was really in charge here still. And his sons, who would have been 30 years old or older, certainly should have known better. And they just basically blew their father off. And this terrible corruption continued. Eli's response when they did this, instead of giving them tough love, instead of stopping this altogether, he just did nothing. He didn't restrain his sons. So God's judgment is, God tells Eli, "I will judge his house forever for their iniquity, which he knows." He wouldn't have done that personally, but he knows what his children are doing because his sons made themselves vile and he restrained them not. And then something else is said here that's really challenging to us as parents. It says he's going to basically lose his life and his family's going to lose their position, this honored position in the priesthood, because he honored his sons above the Lord. Is that a temptation sometimes? You want to keep peace at home? Not want to have a falling out with a family member who needs to be admonished? Or in this case, stopped from doing something that they shouldn't be doing? Cared more about his sons than he did the Lord and the holy purpose that God had given him in the tabernacle. So the problem with Eli isn't that he wasn't personally righteous in his own life, but when it comes to his parenting, he did not restrain, correct, discipline, or train them to do right. And as a result, he is going to be condemned. So what does that tell us? We can't control the free moral agency of our children. Obviously, some people, for whatever reason, reject our example and our training and our discipline. But we can be held accountable if we are honoring our children over the Lord, and we are only willing to talk to them or teach them, but not willing to restrain and correct and to disciple them as they need to be discipled. So, the other thing I think is important about this is that when I talk to people about training, they often sort of look at me puzzled and wonder exactly what do I mean by that. And I'm convinced that all parents are training their children all the time, whether they realize it or not, consciously or unconsciously. In fact, I challenge every parent, particularly of young children, to consciously think, what am I training my children to do or not to do? Because you may find that you're training them to do the opposite of what you intend. I don't know how many times I've been at a grocery store and I'm waiting in line and there's a woman with a shopping cart and a child there, in the top of the shopping cart there for the space for the child to be put. And of course they see these impulse items and they're colorful and they're candy and all these things. And so they start fussing and wanting the items there. Understandable. And so the mother says, no, you don't need the candy. No, you don't need that. And so the more the mother says no, the more the kid starts throwing a fit. And then the mom gets embarrassed and then finally gives in and says, okay, here. And so the kid stops fussing. The mother's no longer embarrassed, and you didn't wind up having a scene. The problem is that mother just taught that child that throwing a fit works. That if I throw a fit at the grocery store long enough, even though mom said no before, eventually she'll give in and say yes. And so you just created a huge problem for yourself as a parent. And it's not the kid's fault. It's the parents' lack of willingness to stick to what they said, and when they said no, and not to reward bad behavior. But I've been amazed how many times parents do this and have no clue what's going on. Almost every mother and father have to deal with children at some point that begin to whine. I mean, what parent hasn't had kids sometimes come up and, this terrible kind of shrieking, whining sound. And sometimes to get the kid to quit whining, they make the mistake of giving the kid what they're whining about and what they want. What did you just train your child to do? To whine. Whining works. Instead of being really clear, I hate that sound. We don't whine in this house. So no, you're not going to get what you asked for because you whined about it. You go off there and think for a while about this, and then come back later and ask in a non-whining, normal, nice tone of voice, and you'll get a much better response. So then you train them to come back, and sometimes they'll still kind of whine a bit. You go, nope, you're still whining. Try again, not good enough. Then when they come back with a nice, respectful, normal tone of voice, may I please have a piece of candy or whatever it is? Yes, I'll be glad to give you a piece of candy. That's perfectly all right. And what a nice, respectful way you ask. Yay, good job. You can stop whining real quick by making sure that if they ever whine, they never, ever, ever get what they're whining about. If they learn it never works, guess what? They stop whining. It's really not all that hard. But it's an insight that over the years I found that a lot of parents are really clueless about. I heard a while back about a mother had said no to her child about something, and the child still kept on badgering the mother about it. Come on, please, come on, please. And an adult overheard the 9-year-old friend of this child say, "Why do you do that? Your mother said no." And the child says, "Well, even if mom says no now, I've learned that if I beg her long enough, she will eventually say yes." And my guess is that's probably true. So who's controlling whom? And the mother had no idea that she'd trained her child not to believe her when she said no. And so you get badgered and whined at and a whole bunch of other things. Another thing I find quite interesting is Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 25 and 26. This is where Moses had asked the Lord 3 times, the Bible says, to change his mind about him not being able to go over to the promised land and to see the promised land. I mean, it wasn't Moses' fault that the people rebelled and were faithless and had an evil heart of unbelief, and then he had to take them for 38 more years wandering around the wilderness. Here in his old age, he just wanted to finally go in and see the promised land. And he besought the Lord 3 times. And then this is what happened the 3rd time. "Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan. But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me," because the people are saying, "You're not going to go with us?" "That is enough," the Lord said. "Do not speak to me anymore about this matter." So here's a case where Moses kind of kept on coming after God, trying to get God to change his mind. And God had already decided that Moses needed, as a public example, to show the children of Israel that even Moses was not above the law. And so for the people's sake, the lesson the people needed to learn about this, he wasn't going to answer Moses' request in the positive. And after 3 times, the Lord finally said, "Don't ask me anymore." I think it's appropriate sometimes, if you've got a child who just keeps on asking and asking, even if they ask respectfully. In my family, occasionally, I told my kids this story, and I said, "Now, when I say Moses, you know that means don't ask me again." Because we got this example here of God and Moses. And so that was kind of the way, okay, you can come back and sort of ask for an appeal. That's reasonable, but the 3rd time, it's enough. The answer is still no. So how are you training your children? What if you give a child a command and you repeat 3 times before there's any, that word says disciple, should be discipline. So you tell the child, "Come to dinner," and they don't come, and "Come to dinner," and they don't come, and "Come to dinner," and they don't come, and then finally you stomp down the hall and you stand there with your hands on your hips, and now you're really upset, and the child sees it, and now they come. Well, what if you just trained your child to do? Come only after you say it the 4th time, and you come down the hall and put your hands on your hips and are mad. Do you want to go through that every night, really? What if you repeat it 3 times, then you yell to really get the point across? Then maybe there's some discipline or some punishment or revoking of a privilege or something. Well, you're then training the child that the first 3 times really don't matter, and only when she starts yelling at me do I need to respond. Of course, I don't recommend that you ever yell at your children. I don't think it's necessary. Speak softly and carry a big stick. But what if you repeat 3 times, then yell, then give a warning or some sort of threat? Well, you're just training the child to learn that even the yelling really doesn't matter. I don't have to pay that much attention until they start giving me some sort of threat or warning. Now I need to respond. So the parent decides when the child is going to respond. And so many times parents frustrate themselves and the children by not recognizing that you just have to decide after the first time you call in a normal tone of voice, if you're sure they heard you. If they don't call, there's some sort of consequence. I remember years ago we were at Pizza Hut, and there were some other people around, and the kids were getting pretty rambunctious, and you could tell that it was getting a little loud. They were excited about going out for pizza. And so, I went over and I said, that's enough. You guys quiet down. You're making a disturbance here. And about 3 or 4 minutes later, they were right back to what they were before. So how do you handle this? They just basically ignored what we told them. Well, I looked over at Gail, and so basically we just looked over at him and said, we're going home. We're not going to have pizza. You're not going to be with your friends. You just spoiled this really fun time together with friends. That's on you because you didn't do what we told you to do the first time we told you. So we went home. Gail fed him some sandwiches and put him to bed early. May sound kind of harsh, but you know what? Next time they were at a restaurant, they behaved like angels. I mean, it's so easy to do it in a way that gets their attention the first time, early on, and let there be some sort of immediate consequence so they learn the lesson. It's better for them, better for you. Train up a child in the way they should go. When they're old, they'll not depart from it. What is the solution? Well, don't threaten things you won't follow through on. I think I mentioned that last Sunday evening. Certainly don't say you're going to wring their neck or you're going to ground them for a year or something crazy. Think through what you're going to do when certain boundaries are violated, and make sure that if they violate that the first time, that you follow through. You do it in love. You do it without raising your voice. You speak softly and carry a big stick. And after you call them once and there's no response, you follow through immediately with some sort of penalty, some sort of situation where they're going to remember next time if you hear mom calling, they need to come immediately. Well, what about temper tantrums? What kid has not at different times tried to just throw a fit? And if somebody's embarrassed or they can't stand the temper tantrum, and so they give in to the temper tantrum, guess what you just taught that child? Temper tantrums work. So anytime I really want to get what I want, I just throw a temper tantrum. So you have to make sure you never, ever, ever give in to a temper tantrum, even once. I mean, whose kid hasn't tried this at some point? So, sorry you're upset. That's too bad. You're not going to get this thing that you want. It's not up to you. It's up to mom and dad. So you go to your room, and when you're ready to be cheerful, then you can come out. But otherwise, this isn't going to help you at all. I mean, you just basically don't allow kids to control the parents by throwing temper tantrums. You're the parent, they're the child. Everyone's happier if you follow these basic principles of training. Maybe the child receives a gift, and you've been teaching them over and over again to say thank you when they receive a gift, and they don't. Well, instead of just saying, now you should have said thank you and let them keep the gift, I recommend you take the gift away until they show an attitude of gratefulness. Because unless you teach them the importance of gratefulness and saying thank you and model it before them, they won't learn this extremely important character trait. Teach giving by teaching them the joy of giving from their own allowance. Different researchers kind of come up with different ideas based on a child's maturity as to at what point they have their money. But if you can have them do certain chores and they get certain payment for those helpful chores and they have their own allowance, you immediately need to start teaching them about giving 10% of their allowance to the Lord. Do not have them put your money or your check in the basket as a way of teaching them about giving. It doesn't teach them anything about giving. They haven't given anything. They've just put your check in the plate. That's actually the opposite kind of message. That's easy. There's no sacrifice. There's no gift on their part at all. So you put your money in the plate and you have them put their money in the plate. That's a much better way to give them the joy of giving and to teach them at a very young age the importance of honoring the Lord and giving him the first fruits of their increase. My dad used to say, if you don't teach children to be generous with a little, when they're adults, they won't be generous with a lot. I think there's a lot of truth in that. So, why is this so rare? Well, one reason is it's, frankly, rarely taught. I mean, I never heard this until I was in my early 30s. Maybe I just wasn't paying enough attention, but Gail and I read a bunch of books, and, I was raised pretty well, I thought, but I don't remember these kind of things happening. Maybe they happened when I was so young that I didn't recall it. But this was like this defining moment for Gail and me in regards to helping us be so much better parents and learn how to have our children under loving control. It's rarely taught, so I wanted to have a lesson just on this tonight. And it's inconvenient. That's why Solomon keeps on talking about be diligent in your discipline. I mean, it takes effort. Of course, that's true of all kinds of training, isn't it? It takes effort to teach, informally, formally. All these different things take effort. It's a part of being a parent. And it is easier sometimes to do certain jobs yourself, right? Sometimes the mom could clean up the room quicker than you could tell the child to clean up their own room. And you probably do a better job. But what does that teach the child? That mom has to always pick up for me? Or when I drop something, I pick it up myself? So a lot of parenting is understanding how they need to learn to do these things on their own under supervision, so they'll know how to do them when the parental supervision is no longer there. In the case of Gail and Amy and Allison, she was really good about teaching the kids how to cook and giving them lessons on how to sew and teaching them life skills. That's all a part of training. And I taught them how to balance a checkbook and how to budget and all those different things. And you do it when they're young so they don't mess up as a young adult. And they never got taught at home. Bottom line is, this is time-consuming hard work. And yet it is so worth it. Consistency, I think, is especially difficult. And yet it's probably one of the most important things that you and your spouse, if you have a spouse at home with you, and I hope you do, but if you don't, do the best you can. But the two need to try to be on the same page, because otherwise you'll hang separately if you don't hang together, right? They'll play one against the other. And they can be pretty shrewd in doing that. And so you need to make sure that you're not going to be inconsistent between what mom says and what dad says. And you're not constantly arbitrarily changing the rules. That's not fair to them, and it makes them feel very insecure. And so you need to clearly spell out what the rules are, what the boundaries are, what the expectations are. And then as things happen, you remind them of these discussions about what they can and can't do and why. Somebody said that we sometimes do to our children something very cruel. Could you imagine being a blind man, and the blind man has gotten everything figured out about where the furniture is in the house, and he can walk with pretty good confidence because he knows where the pathways are in this house? And then while he's sleeping, somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and rearranges all the furniture without telling him. Now he gets up and he thinks he can walk with confidence, and he bangs his shin up against the dresser drawer, and he walks over here and he's banging, and all of a sudden he's just completely feeling ill at ease and awkward and not confident in his own home because the furniture is not where it's supposed to be. That's sort of what we do when we arbitrarily change the rules and are inconsistent with our children. You have babysitters and things like that. Try to make sure the basic boundaries are laid out So the poor kids don't have to worry about all these different rules and what's acceptable at school and what's acceptable at home and what's acceptable with mom and dad and grandparents and all these different things. Makes the kid feel very insecure. On the other hand, if they know what the rules are and where the boundaries are, and that they can run in those lanes with everyone's approval and affirmation, then they feel really content and peaceful and secure. So, think about these different skill sets for parents. Nurture, admonition, instruction, and training. And if you do that, you're going to find it is really worth it. But just remember, undisciplined parents are not going to be able to have disciplined children. If you want disciplined children, you have to be disciplined, right? I mean, you obviously have to role play that before you. Okay, I hope these things have been helpful to you. I wish I'd understood these principles, before our children were born. We figured them out later. And yet, it really kind of makes common sense when you stop and think about it. So, thank you all for being here. Don't forget, Friday night at 7:30, David Banning will be giving our kind of keynote address for our weekend. Then Saturday from 10 to 12, he'll have some morning sessions that are more interactive. And even though he's going to be talking about our youth, that's not just for youth, or it's not designed for parents with children. Everybody in the church, we'd like to have David be able to talk with us about what we can do as a congregation to encourage faith in our youth. And then 2 to 4 after lunch on Saturday, we have this really amazing material about embracing open doors and about how you can listen to things that people say and then use that as a bridge to shift the conversation over to things spiritual. David says it's just really kind of opened his eyes to some ways that he can be more effective in sharing his faith. And then, of course, Sunday morning we'll have our regular Bible classes, and then David will speak for us for the morning sermon and for the evening as well. So, have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you again. Have an invitation song. If anybody's ready to respond to the invitation, you can come now as together we stand and we sing.